Charles, as a child, you were kidnapped by a man. Would you tell us what the circumstances were which brought about this misfortune? Well, I grew up in an unusual environment in Basel, Switzerland. I was 4 years old at the time of this event, and I had always experienced my mother as being mentally ill. Often, she didn't even leave the house. But every now and then there were some highlights, especially when we went to a lovely park in Basel to have a picnic. But no one thought that such a beautiful event like having a picnic would bring about such a problem. Neither my mother, probably, nor myself. We were alone, my mother and I. My father, in fact, had died shortly before I was born. And somehow, presumably, this situation triggered my mother's mental illness. She suffered from schizophrenia, and it was often very difficult to get in touch with her emotionally. So I really enjoyed these joint excursions very much. That is, when they did take place. Then came this day. As I said, I was about 4 years old, and it was in the summer of 1964. Although I don't remember a lot of things, strangely enough, I remember this event as if it had been yesterday. Well, it was around noon, and it was, as I said, summer. The sun was high in the sky. I was somewhat bored, and I lingered on the edge of the nearby forest, breaking off branches there for a castle I had built. In the meantime, my mother was talking to someone she probably had just met, quite spontaneously, and only from time to time did she concern herself as to her son's whereabouts. And at some point, there was a young man. My mother said he was around 20 years old, and strangely enough, I can remember his face very well. He almost had a boy's face, with fuzz on his face, so not really a proper beard. And he offered to help me and to play a little with me. And that was, of course, exciting for me. I was very happy because there was finally someone who took an interest in me. And so this was about me and my castle now. And first of all, that was a really good experience for me. And then he started telling me about beautiful places that he knew of very close by. But I was unsure. I still remember that feeling today. I kept looking to my mother, who didn't bother much about me, and at some point, this man suddenly grabbed me and put me on an old military bike that he had with 2 saddlebags. And when I said to him that I have to tell my mother first, he said to me, "Oh no, I'll bring you back in a minute." And by then, he had already set off. I could just barely hold on underneath the saddle where these springs are, but it was an unpleasantly strange feeling, and I suddenly felt that something wasn't right. But I was only 4 years old and couldn't do much. I was so surprised. And then he drove into the forest. I still remember that we drove on a pretty bumpy road, and now and then it hurt my fanny quite a bit. And then at some point he stopped, lifted me off the bike, and continued walking with me on foot a little further into the fairly dense undergrowth. And in the midst there, I'd say, presumably he had already prepared this space, was a kind of narrow clearing. Not very big, probably. As I said, I was a small child, and so everything looked bigger than in fact it might have really been. And there he spread out a blanket. I hadn't seen it before, so presumably the blanket was already there previously. And then he took my clothes away. In detail, it's probably not all that interesting what happened then. All I still remember is that I suddenly had the spontaneous idea of distracting him with a question, so to speak, saying that my mother would always use an ointment to help soothe the reddening of my bottom. And he then threatened me and said very clearly, "Don't you dare move away. You stay here. I'm just going to my bike to get some ointment." And thereupon, when he was out of my range of vision, something happened that I have never forgotten, and that even today I still cannot explain. I heard a voice calling me by name, and this voice said, "Charlie, get up, run." And I am convinced that I wouldn't have moved an inch away from there. I would have let everything happen to me that was going to happen, and luckily I didn't know what would have happened then. But it certainly wouldn't have been a lot of fun. So I'm happy that this particular event then occurred. So I stood up, naked as I was, walked through the forest in the opposite direction, and I saw, well, it's really difficult to estimate. As I said, I was a small child, but what I saw was located near the lowest branches of the trees to the right, maybe 10 feet away, if I had to estimate it today. And there was a very bright light there. And the light was so bright that at first I thought it was the sun. And out of this light came the voice urging me to keep running. And at every moment when I slowed down, out of sheer curiosity, and started looking at the light to see what this actually was, I was then repeatedly asked to run about 3 or 4 times. And I can remember that when I walked around some trees, thereby probably changing the direction a bit, the light stayed all the time in the same place. So the whole time it was a little bit diagonally and to the right of me, pretty close to the forest floor. I don't know if I saw outlines every now and then. I'm not sure anymore. But I heard a wonderfully warm voice, but which left no doubt that I had to do exactly what it said. And maybe it was also because I was called by my name that I just had confidence. And I came out of the forest to a place where my mother seemingly was looking for me, together with this strange man and a few other people she had organized. And this was a kind of playground. They were all amazed, of course, when I suddenly came running naked out of the forest. And then I told them what had happened. But I didn't say anything about this special experience. I only told them about the incident with this man, because I was somehow so impressed by this supreme experience that I never spoke of it for a very, very long time. My mother didn't know about it either for a long time. When you first heard the voice, did you see the light then? No, it came from behind me. I was lying on the ground and saw this man running away, and the voice was behind me, and this was then the direction in which I ran. The voice was like a kind of guide, but I only saw the light when I turned around toward that direction, thereby breaking through the undergrowth there. Only then did I see the light. Before, I didn't see it. Could this light figure be described as a kind of guardian spirit? That's a good question. I've thought about that too. There was a time when I thought that it might have been my father who was sent to save me from this awkward predicament. That was one idea I had about that. And later on, another idea I had was that it might have been an angel who helped me. So I can't say for sure. The only thing I know is that the feeling I had was really of being surrounded by love at that moment and by an authority that I would not have dared to contradict, because I knew that this was for the good, without my being able to grasp it intellectually at the time. Well, what has always impressed me, most of all, is the strong feeling of being sheltered. That I was not alone in that moment, because previously I had felt completely alone there on the forest floor, And actually, I even felt alone with my mother, because she mainly and primarily was self-absorbed, also considering her illness. And then on that day, she primarily devoted herself to this man she just met instead of me. And then someone came along promising me that something was good and that something will be beautiful today. But he then turned out to be a villain. But surely this voice I heard, and this light I perceived, and this warmth I felt, as well as this clarity, making me understand that I must and may obey, and then finally conveying to me that this was good. Did you find out later what had happened? Was this criminal caught? I don't think my mother ever reported this case to the police, because she was so preoccupied with herself, and I think she was also afraid of opening official investigations, because then her role in the whole story would also have been questioned, as well as her health. As I said, mostly she locked herself up. I had to sell the wedding rings so that we had something to eat. And I also bought some clothing for her. I bought the food, provided my own birthday and Christmas presents. She didn't leave the house for months, just every now and then. And this was then for a longer period of time. I don't think she ever tried to report this incident, which actually would have made sense. But for me, this thing was done and gone. I was saved. As a rule, memories of the time when you were 4 years old are not so strong. So why do you remember this so well? Well, I think because it was such a powerful experience. It has forever been the most sublime experience I had up to then, forever standing above all. It was so memorable, something so exceptional, that you can't forget it. As time went by, I even remembered more and more details. And so in the beginning, it was just the light and the voice I remembered. First, I thought it was the sun. Later, my intellect told me clearly that it couldn't have been the sun, because the sun was up there, high in the sky. And today, I'm just not quite sure. But I think I saw a small silhouette, but I can't swear to it. But one thing I know for sure, this voice was so clear, so distinct, and this light so beautifully bright. So if the sky looks like this, emanating this light, I will surely feel comfortable there. What impact did this experience have on your future life? Well, I need to give a little bit more detail on that. As I said, my mother was very ill, and at some point she had to undergo medical examination. She was then picked up and taken to a clinic. She was diagnosed with schizophrenia and paranoia. I was then taken to a Christian home for children, and that's actually where the real impact of this experience on my life begins. Apart from the fact that I had been saved, what was, of course, the primary effect, but this home was, compared to the fact that my previous experience with my mother was not the best, because I wasn't looked after very much by her, and I was often outside, and as a street child, I experienced almost everything, from sexual abuse from older boys, for example, to violence. Well, I sometimes thought it was really an adventure that we only know from India. But this happened in Basel, in the very center of Basel. And there was no one who would have helped, nobody who was there, until suddenly just this authority that then came to pick up my mother, thereby tearing us apart. And of course, that was bad for me, despite everything, because she was my only caregiver over those years. Thereafter, I was taken to a home that was bursting with human coldness. I was locked up. Can you imagine that? And I don't know why. Chastised with leather straps when someone wet the bed, for example. And I mean, as an 8-year-old, you are in a bit of distress when you no longer have your mother, nor any warmth, not knowing what would happen. And that's when this special experience started to affect me. So I held on to the thought that there is someone watching over me. And I think this was salvation for me, to have survived this time, these few years in this Christian children's home, reasonably well. It left traces, yes, one way or another. I'm still frightened in the dark today, and there is nothing I can do to change it. I always need some light. And I've thought about 1,000 times why I might have been confined in this dark room, in this chamber, but I don't know why. There is no clue in my memory. That is, my memory has largely erased it. There are individual memories from that time, about 12 or 15, and all of them very dark. But this one feeling that there is someone watching over me, and if necessary, saving me, that has remained, and that has helped me, as I see it, to get through this time reasonably well. It's interesting that precisely because I was in a Christian children's home, one might think that I no longer have anything to do with faith. But also in this respect, this experience did affect me in a very special way. For some reason, I was able to differentiate early on what people do and what the divine does. And the divine protected me, saved me. It was watching over me. People did the opposite. And even if they were Christian-oriented, it was then no problem for me to separate that. And despite all this, still to this day, I turn to God in prayer again and again, entrusting myself to His guidance. And this is also related to this experience. And it is always impressive for me how something like this could have shaped an entire life. And despite all the obstacles and despite the rigors I had to face, and this gives me a strong feeling that life continues when it is finished on earth, and that there is more than this earthly life, that there is meaning and purpose in life. And that's what this experience taught me in particular. Charles, thank you very much for the interview.